was a girl the whole village could not stop talking about. People pointed when she walked. Children stared. Old women nodded and smiled. Her long black braids fell like a river down her back. The braids caught light and caught eyes. They were a gift from her mother, and the last bright thing left from a home that once felt safe. A new woman came to the house after the mother died. The woman called herself Naoka. She wore polite words and kept a cold temper beneath her smile. Where kindness should have been, there was a quiet hunger for praise and status. The house changed. So did the way people looked at Lulu. The story begins with a small cruelty and a large secret. Naoka watched Lulu and counted everything she did not own. The way people watched, the way men bowed their heads in the market, the care with which neighbors braided Lulu's hair in the shade of the mango tree. Naoka's jealousy began like a thin frost. It spread. Hair was more than hair in this village. It was a memory and a promise. The mother braided Lulu's hair every night. With each braid came a word of wisdom. The mother told Lulu that beauty would open doors, but the heart would hold the key. Those were the last words before illness took her away. A simple truth lived in the house and on the street. A braiding hand could give comfort. A harsh hand could take everything. The braid was inheritance. The heart was crown. The first act of cruelty would change everything, and the twist would be crueler than anyone expected. Beauty would become a burden. The story would bend toward a strange justice that no one saw coming. Lulu moved through the village like light. She was quiet, but her face was bright. Children followed her a little, hoping to touch the glossy ends of her braids. Women stopped their chores and looked. Men would lower their baskets and glance twice. The braids made people murmur about luck and favor. People told small stories about the girl with the black hair who never shouted and who always helped sweep the mosque steps or carry a neighbor's water pot. Home was small and warm before the sickness. Lulu's mother braided slowly. She hummed a soft tune while her fingers folded the hair into neat ropes. She would press a palm to Lulu's forehead and say, "Your beauty is your light, but your heart is your crown." The words smelled like warm bread and sun. They settled into Lulu's chest and stayed there even when the house grew quiet. Illness took the mother in a week. It took her voice and her hands and the smell of her cooking. The day she left, Lulu sat by the bed and held her mother's dry hand until it stopped moving. The village wrapped the mother in cloth, and the people said quiet prayers. Lulu watched the procession from the doorway. The braids in her hair felt weightier after that. They felt like a promise she had to keep. Bako, Lulu's father, was a tender man with tired shoulders. He had always smiled softly and trusted in small hopes. He worked the ground and sold milk at the market. He loved Lulu, but he could not hold back the cold wind that followed the mother's death. He did not have the strength to fight a woman who arrived with her own plan. Naoka stepped into the empty place with neat words and a patient voice. Bako believed he was doing what was right for the home. Lulu learned grief the way children learn rain. It came day after day until the world was wet with sorrow. But she kept the lessons her mother had stitched into her. She smiled at the sunrise. She swept the yard. She whispered that beauty belongs to the heart, and she tended to kindness the way a gardener tends a stubborn plant. Naoka carried herself like someone who had practiced being polite in a mirror. She promised Bako a steady hand on the house and a calm voice for the child. Her daughter, Tamina, was small and painted with attention. She favored bright fabrics and bright faces. Where Lulu moved with quiet ease, Tamina strode with a practiced flutter of lashes and perfume. People at the market noticed the new family. Some said Tamina had a palace kind of beauty, all bright clothes and careful hair. Others still whispered about Lulu's natural look that no paint could copy. The whispers turned into small riddles in the marketplace, and a slow current of comparison ran through the village. When women braided hair under the mango, their hands paused. They compared faces. They said small things like, "She is pretty," but not like Lulu. Tamina heard some of this and learned to scowl. At first, Things changed in small ways. Naoka set Lulu to work with the early light. "Sweep the compound," she ordered. "Wash the dishes by noon. Carry water from the well." The orders were simple, but they built up. Tamina received lace and softness. She sat by the doorway and watched television or stared at herself in a small glass. She never learned to carry more than a basket of nails. Lulu's days narrowed. She rose with a sore back and fell asleep with aching hands. When neighbors passed, they asked after Lulu's mother and gave her small bread. They praised Lulu's gentle ways, and they mourned how quickly a kind hand can vanish. The praise did not reach the rooms where Naoka sat. Naoka measured Lulu's worth by what she had and what she could make others see. Nights became the loneliest time. Lulu lay on her thin mat and listened for her mother's humming in the rafters. The stepmother's polite voice sounded in the next room, but it never reached down into the little bed where Lulu kept memories tucked beneath an old shawl. She dreamed of her mother's hand braiding, the slow, steady rhythm that promised safety. The dream became both comfort and hunger. Jealousy grew like a vine that loosened its grip on the wall. Naoka watched the village's attention as if it were a pile of coins. Each look at Lulu felt like a small theft to her. She tightened her jaw and made a rule for the house. "Why waste food on her when my daughter needs richness?" she muttered once, while Bako listened and did not answer. Tamina's small successes fed the stepmother. She began to mock Lulu openly. She would pass Lulu in the courtyard and fling a careless laugh. She would smear lipstick on her cup and compare the shine to Lulu's plain face. People in the lanes began to feel the sharp edge of the house's change. The women who had once braided Lulu now looked away more quickly, as if guilt were the thing that shone. Naoka withheld small kindnesses and gave the largesse she had to Tamina. There were days when Lulu's plate was nearly empty. There were evenings when she lay barefoot and watched Tamina's painted nails flash in the lamplight. The village that loved Lulu shifted in voice. The praise reached her like distant thunder, but the house's door closed on her with every command. Her hair then became more than beautiful. It became the only proof that someone cared once. Lulu held to her braids like a child takes a blanket. When the wind moved through the market and lifted the ends, she would close her eyes and imagine her mother's hands combing slowly. The memory tightened like a band around her heart. Even so, Lulu kept gentleness. She gave the neighbor's baby a bit of tea when she had little to spare. She tended to a tired hen and kept its nest safe. The village elders noticed that Lulu never struck back, even when scorn was hurled. She spoke softly and bowed to the elders, and they would pat her hand with warm, complicated looks. At night, she sat outside and watched stars like far, cool eyes. She would whisper to the empty air the words her mother had said. The whisper became a prayer and a shield. "I will carry my heart like a crown," she would say aloud in the dark. The phrase was not enough to stop the growing plan behind the polite smile. The town crier came one morning, beating a small drum and calling until people filled the main square. He wore bright cloth and a voice that made the dust hush. "The prince will hold a royal dance," he announced, "and a bride will be chosen." The drumbeat changed the air. The villagers felt something pull at them, as if a season had changed, and the whole year would shift with that evening. Lulu stood among the crowd and felt her heart move like a bird. The idea of a dance carried more than music. It carried a chance to leave the small house and the weight of daily work. It carried a chance to be seen where the seeing mattered. Her hands tightened on the edge of her skirt, and she remembered her mother's words with a clear spark. Naoka learned of it like a blade, learning its edge. She folded her face into a mask of calm and told Tamina to prepare. Tamina flounced in the doorway and practiced a small laugh. She painted her lips and counted dresses aloud. It pleased Naoka to see her daughter loud and bright. The news settled into her bones like a plan. Lulu moved quietly toward her father and asked, in a soft voice she had learned to use, if she might go. Bako blinked and reached for an answer he did not know how to give. The idea of the daughter who kept the house going to a court dance sounded like a story someone else would tell. Naoka's eyes narrowed. She said the things she had practiced. How would you go with no fine dress and with no gift suited to a prince? Her voice was thin and meant to cut. The village spoke. Some said Lulu should go and that the prince would choose a brave heart. Others shook their heads and feared trouble. In small corners of the square, women sewed ribbons and lent a scrap of blue cloth. A neighbor offered a small coin. For the first time in many days, Lulu allowed herself to imagine stepping beneath lanterns and someone taking her hand in dance. Naoka's thoughts were a net. She watched Lulu as a farmer watches a harvest he does not intend to share. Her mind scrubbed clean of pity. There was only a plan. Her hands smoothed a dress, and she used a voice that sounded like help when she spoke to Tamina. That night, she waited until the house slept, and the thin lamp burned low. She moved like a shadow into Lulu's room. The room smelled of soap and the faint lemon of cloth rinsed in the river. Lulu lay with her braid coiled on the mat like a sleeping rope. Naoka carried scissors small and sharp in her palm. She thought she could take what people used to praise and make it mean nothing. She thought she could shrink the girl into the shadow she belonged to, make the world look at her daughter instead. The cutting was methodical. Snip after snip, braid after braid. The sound was small and final. The thick ropes fell upon the floor like dark fruit. When Naoka stepped back, she pressed her lips together and let a small, cruel satisfaction warm her chest. The braids were on the mat. The morning would change. At dawn, Lulu woke with a start and reached for the braid she always kept near. Her hand closed on empty air. She sat upright and felt the cold floor. Then she saw the hair on the ground. Her voice tore the quiet like a bird taking flight without warning. She touched the top of her head and found only skin. She collapsed to her knees, and the sound of her crying filled the small house. Naoka stood in the doorway with a practiced frown, and Tamina stood behind her, lips curled with triumph. They threw words like stones. "Rid yourself of dreams now," Naoka said, in a voice that did not bother to hide the pleasure inside it. "No prince will look at a bald head." Tamina chimed and laughed. The house that had always held a soft center cracked open, and the small pieces fell where they would. Lulu's world narrowed to a single truth. The hair that had been a promise was no longer there. She sat with the weight of loss on her knees and felt the cold press of humiliation. Shame rose in her throat, heavy and bitter. Amina found Lulu before the sun had climbed the market pole. She had been a friend since they were small, a steady hand and a quick smile. When Amina saw Lulu's head bare, she did not gasp with wonder. She wrapped her arms around Lulu and held her tight. The hug smelled like dried mango and the confidence of someone who understands pain. Lulu's tears were long, and she did not try to hide them. Amina spoke with a low voice and steady rhythm. She said the words mothers and friends say when homes are full of sharp things. She reminded Lulu that hair could be cut, but courage could not. She pointed to the blue dress that she had been saving for a good day. She took from a box a heavy scarf set with small bright stones and placed it in Lulu's shaking hands. The scarf fit like a second skin. It covered the bare scalp and shone under the sun as if it had its own light. The dress was plain but perfect. Amina had sewn it carefully, stitched in tiny hems, and pressed it where a seam needed to lie smooth. She lifted Lulu's chin and told her that the scarf could be a crown if Lulu chose to wear it that way. Doubt sat heavy in Lulu's chest. Shame still warmed the edges. But courage is stubborn. Lulu felt a small flare in the part of her where her mother's words lived. The heart is a crown, she thought, and put the scarf on. She dressed slowly, each movement a prayer and a promise. She did not try to cover the loss with a fake laugh. She let it be seen and chose to carry it differently. When she stepped from Amina's hut, the scarf shone and the dress moved like water. Children stopped and stared in a new way. It was not pity that showed in their eyes. It was attention and a soft, growing admiration. Lulu walked straight through the dust, toward the place where the villagers were speaking of the dance, each step a measured claim on what she might yet be. The palace had long stone steps and lanterns that made small moons over the courtyard. Musicians beat drums in a slow, steady heart. Lanterns hung from rafters and light pooled in the corners. The air smelled of roasted yam and oil. Women from all the hamlets came, dresses bright as birds. The prince stood on a raised platform like a quiet man among light. His eyes moved slowly and measuredly over the gathered girls. Tamina arrived in silk and shine. She held her head high, a practiced smile on her face. Nayoka walked behind her with the satisfied air of someone who had arranged everything to the exact piece. They moved like a pair that expected applause. Lulu entered with her scarf and her dress simple, but something in the way she carried herself pulled the room's breath inward. She did not hide the baldness. She showed the scarf as though it were a badge of something hard-won. There was a hush that was not cruel. It sounded like people making way for a truth. Whispers drifted through the crowd. Some were cruel, some soft. But the prince's eyes found Lulu and lingered with a steady warmth. He was not moved by the surface. He watched the way she held herself, how she did not flinch under the gaze. He watched how she returned a bow with a steady look. Nayoka leaned forward and hissed small insults like knives in the wind. Tamina opened her mouth to mock with a voice practiced in scorn. The gallery tensed as if waiting for a collapse. The prince walked slowly, and his hand reached for Lulu. He offered it like an answer that had been waiting for the right question. The music swelled and they turned. They did not dance to be seen. They danced to speak with their bodies. Each step was calm and true. Crowds watched, and the common breath of the village pressed close. When the prince raised Lulu's hand before the crowd, he spoke in a voice that did not hold ceremony for vanity. He spoke of courage worn like a crown. He chose Lulu not because her hair had been bright, but because her heart had never dimmed. Nayoka's face lost color. Tamina's mouth opened and closed without sound. The turning was complete. The plan had broken against the one truth the house could not steal. The villagers who had watched the long shadow of cruelty found a new place to set their admiration. Lulu stood with a quiet light inside her that no cruel act could pluck out. Nayoka staggered as if struck. The anger inside her turned to a raw, exposed shape. She tried to speak, to press the people with old rules, but voices rose and turned away from her. Tamina cried out, small and lost, the sound of someone discovering that the world did not bend to practice and paint. Lulu's crowning was not a mere placing of gold. It was a slow coming together of the village's belief and the prince's choice. He placed a simple circlet at first, then a heavier crown when the people's oath settled in. Lulu accepted it, with hands that remembered hard labor and eyes that remembered a mother's hand. She stood and spoke words that felt like the last sewing in a long seam. Her voice carried across the square and did not tremble. She spoke of the woman who braided hair and of the promise that beauty is not a thing to be stolen. She said that kindness and courage were the true measures of a person. The words fell into the ears of girls and mothers and the men who had watched the market for years. They wore the words like small new clothes. The scarf became a symbol. Women and girls began to wrap their own heads in pieces of cloth that shone in the sun. The scarf started in Amina's house and traveled across the fields. It became not a mark of sorrow, but a sign of strength. Where once shame would hide, the scarf now sat like a flag. Nayoka and Tamina left the house in a way that matched the smallness of their victory. They faded from the market conversations and took the narrow paths away from the village's center. There was quiet there, and a slow learning that cruelty has a cost. Lulu's rule did not begin with loud decree. She walked the lanes and spoke to mothers and men who worked late. She sat with children who had little and listened. The crown sat light because she wore its weight with care. Her first acts were to teach that a child's worth is counted by kindness and not by another person's gaze. Years moved in a steady way. Scarves bright with beadwork became common on heads across the valley. Girls who bore marks from life wrapped cloth and stood proud at water pumps and market stalls. Mothers taught daughters a new prayer: hold your heart like a crown, and do not give it away to anyone who will not care for it. Lulu grew with seasons. As queen, she carried the lessons braided into her memory. She named small schools and built a small house for women who needed shelter from cruel words. She laughed sometimes in the market and sometimes sat in quiet, remembering the woman who had braided her hair at night. Nayoka and Tamina found places at the edge of town where their steps did not echo much. The village did not celebrate their return. The old practice of gossip turned instead toward stories of change and of the blue scarf that began by a friend's careful hands. The crown on Lulu's head did not weigh her down. It taught the village how to measure one another by deeds and by heart. Children learned to say the last line her mother said long ago, and it passed like a promise. You can steal someone's crown, but never their courage.